Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategic planning for the NCAI Fund Victim Services Microgrant Program. This webinar is co-hosted by the National Congress of American Indians Fund, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and First Pick Incorporated. My name is Esther Labrado. I'm a citizen of the North Fork Rancheria of Mono Indians and a descendant of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians, and I'm a staff attorney here at NCAI. And I want to thank you all again for joining. We again invited everyone who had specifically identified strategic planning as part of their project goals for the microgrant program, but anyone else is welcome. And before we begin, we'll go ahead and go over some housekeeping tips just to make sure everyone knows how to participate in today's webinar. So on your screen, you should see the viewer window, which is where the PowerPoint is displayed. And to the right of that is the control panel. And it should look like the image on the PowerPoint, but if you don't see it, go ahead and look for that small orange arrow. Sometimes the panel minimizes itself. So if you click on that, it will open your control panel. And at the top will be your audio controls. And you can go ahead and join using your computer or by telephone. And if you do want to join by phone, you will need to click the button next to telephone, and that will go ahead and display the audio dial-in information. Below that, in that control panel, is a questions box. We welcome everyone to submit your questions throughout the webinar. We will be monitoring that box, and we'll also pause and have some time for questions at the end. And we also have, you can use the raise your hand feature, which is that icon that has a hand with a green arrow pointing upwards, and that's just below that orange arrow to open and close your control panel. And if you click on that, we can go ahead and unmute your line and you can ask your question verbally. I also want to note we have a couple handouts available, again, within that control panel. And then finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted online and available afterwards at www.tribalvictimservices.org on that technical assistance page. And after the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey, which we would really appreciate any and all feedback on. Great, and with that, next slide. Perfect. So yeah, I want to thank everyone again for joining us. As I mentioned, this webinar is for strategic planning. We're going to go ahead and give an overview of strategic planning, provide some examples of models and processes. And then we really want to highlight some insights, provide suggestions and considerations for your strategic planning process and as you're engaging in an Indigenous and cultural strategic planning process. And so with that, we have some great panelists today, and I will turn it over to Lana Hunter, Tribal Victim Resource Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, to go ahead and introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Hamatakiapie, Lana Hunter Makiapie. My name is Lana Hunter, and I am from the Sistiwaptin Oyate, and my father's people are Tlingit from Southeast Alaska. Welcome this morning. And thank you to the National Congress of American Indians for taking on this task to enable our tribal programs to access federal funds and to be able to provide safety as well as understanding the needs of tribes at that core level, to be able to provide training and technical assistance relating to victim services, relating to safety, and relating to caring for our communities. This morning we have our presenters who work with us at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. We are the technical assistance provider for the victim services within the National Congress of American Indians Microgrant Fund program. So we are excited to welcome our colleagues as well as our relatives who work with us at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute at the Tribal Youth Resource Center. So this morning they can introduce themselves, but I want to present Tasha Fridia, who's the Assistant Director at the Tribal Youth Resource Center, as well as Tui Essling Ironcloud Two Dogs. She's the Senior Technical Assistant Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. And they work alongside us. They don't work with us specifically on this training and technical assistance, so we're honored to have them partner with us today, this morning or afternoon, depending on your location here. But we wanted to start today's webinar on strategic planning with an opening. Tui Essling, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Toja Lana. Mitakuyepi, my relatives, I just like to greet you with a warm handshake from my heart. And I would just like to mention that across Indian country, we are all going through challenges, grief and loss, including enduring this pandemic. And I just like to encourage all of you and thank you for all your work despite all of the challenges that we're going through. And I'm going to do a blessing in my Lakota language. Tunkashila unchile ampetu wopila kanka ukeni chapina tunkashila na unchile daku imongla kapiki oya kapi hechel oyate ki iwashte pite iota tchecha na wakaja pi na waka na tukashila na mitaku ya pila na tukashila wangla ke wichozani wash ake wichaku ye mitaku ye oyasni. All my relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tui Essling. I think it's important during this time to, yes, acknowledge all that our tribal programs are enduring. So thank you so much for that. So for the remainder of our presentation, we're going to have our colleagues and relatives, Tui Essling and Tasha. So I'll turn it over to you folks for the remainder.
Thank you, Toja. Can we have the next slide, Abby? So we are going to be talking about strategic planning, and as Esther, thank you, Esther, for your introductions and your opening. Strategic planning, basically an overview. We don't have the time, within this time frame to go into real depth and detail about strategic planning and the elements, but we would like to share with you our experiences and our information that we've gathered about strategic planning. And one thing we do know is that historically, all of us, Indigenous tribal nations, have always used strategic planning. We knew when to do certain things. So, for example, you see this graphic here. This is from the Lakota perspective. It's the only perspective I can really speak from because that's how that's my ancestry. Plus, I also, grew up with the teachings, and I can only speak from that reference. However, all of you have traditions, you have beliefs, culture, cultural values, ceremonies, and so think about it from that frame of mind, like how did we do strategic planning historically? So in this example, spiritual calendars were followed that involved honoring the Star Nations. So we have, coming up on December 21st, we have the winter solstice. We call it the Wani Choka offerings, the middle of the winter, the mid of the month moon. It's kind of hard to explain, in English, but because our Lakota language, like probably many of your languages, are very conceptual based, and it's very hard to translate them into English. So if we were to look at this framework, like for your strategic planning process, for example, then we would start on the winter solstice. We would start planning, we would start putting things into place. Now, the Lakota people use this time to gather the natural tobacco that is used in the ceremonies, and it's called chashasha, the red willow bark, and they harvested it during a certain time of the year, which is between December 21st and March 21st, the spring equinox. So there's other things that happen within that time period, but we knew that we had to do it then. And we knew that we had to have a plan so that we would have our natural tobacco offerings for the spring ceremonies, the summer ceremonies, and the fall ceremonies, because we can't gather it at any other time. So if we were to use this framework, then you would have, for example, a strategic plan finalized, and implementation would start on March 21st, which corresponds with the spring equinox. So in the Lakota worldview, when March 21st would come, would be noted on the calendar as a time to welcome the thunder beings back, and time for the spring ceremonies to start. So if you were to visualize your strategic plan starting on March 21st, and I'm just using this as an example, and whenever you reach June 21st, which according to the Lakota worldview is the summer solstice, then there's certain times that we make offerings for our Sundance ceremonies, for example. So we knew that we had to be ready for that, be prepared for that. So in terms of strategic planning, then you would monitor the implementation of the strategic planning. How is that going? When you started March 21st up until June 21st, you're monitoring what processes did you put in place, what strategies, activities did you do. So looking at September 21st to 22nd, it just depends on when the sun passes through a certain constellation, is the fall equinox. So that was a traditional time for Lakota people to sit down and plan for the future, the next generation, the next year. What are we going to do? What threats are facing us? So if we were to correspond a strategic planning process with that, for example, then we would evaluate. We would do an evaluation of the strategic plan. Well, this didn't quite work out, but so let's revise it, or this did work, so let's strengthen it. Let's do more of it. And then we would continue on. Between September 21st, September 22nd, December 21st, and we would continue that implementation, evaluation, and monitoring. So that's an example of, how historically we all had a strategic planning process. And so how you are going to design your strategic plan and how you're going to create your timeline is, really up to you all. And, we're here to share, examples. So I'm going to turn it over to Chimchi Tasha. Next slide, please.
Thank you. My name is Tasha Friday. As they said, I am the Assistant Director at the Tribal Youth Resource Center, and I'm Wichita, Kiowa, and Caddo from Oklahoma. So as Enothleen mentioned, really looking at the historical context of what strategic planning looked like in our tribes, whether that's, when did we change camps, gather medicines, hunt or fish at certain times, or even if you were an agricultural tribe, when did you plant certain things and harvest them? Thinking about those kinds of things and the ways that we plan for our survival, we can translate that into this type of strategic planning. But in so doing, we want to look back towards our ancestors and how we traditionally did things. So we'd love for you to share a historical example of strategic planning that your tribal nation has engaged in. And if you want to put those in the chat, then we will read those off and kind of discuss those a bit. So we welcome you to do that now. And while we're giving you all time to do that, I think, the other piece of this is that when we're thinking of strategic planning, and going back to the ways we've traditionally done things, we have to remember that just like other things are in our DNA, this is in our DNA, our spirits and our bodies know these strategic times and these calendars and timelines like Enothleen described for our own tribal nations. And so just really trying to listen to ourselves and to go back and figure out how we did things will really lay a great foundation for your strategic planning moving forward. And I don't see any chats coming in. Let me check the questions. Is everyone familiar with how to use the chat function?
And yes, I'll go ahead and pop in just as a reminder, your control panel may have minimized itself. So go ahead and look for the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen. If you click on that, it will open your control panel and you can type into the questions box, again, any of your historical examples. Thank you.
And I just put a little message in there saying hello. Maybe that will help it pop up for anyone. While they're doing that, do any of the panelists or staff have a historical example that they would like to share with the audience?
This is Lana. So I think, it's important to, note for many of our tribal nations, that it was dictated by, the sources of food or those kinds of precautions and measures that we planned for. For my father's people, the Tlingit people, it was imperative that, we set up our summer camps. And we planned for those throughout the summer that allowed us to focus solely on the gathering process. So gathering of resources, gathering of, just the staples that would last us throughout the year. And then that would allow us in the winter time to, as Tui Ethling mentioned, to be able to plan and sit together. So I think, that time is just critical to be able to sit with, the intergenerational, because our clan houses or long houses were set up that we were matrilineal. So it was the woman's lineage, her family. So it would be her extended family and her children, oftentimes her sisters. And so, the winter time was really set aside for that process of learning stories, but also planning for the next kind of generations. And I think, that intergenerational process, like we talked about in our tribal codes webinar, is really critical to engage our communities and to engage those intergenerational relationships as well.
Thank you, Lana. And just one more example, and then we'll move on to the next slide, and people can still jump in the chat if they would like. But so for my people, the Giddy-Giddies, the Wichita people, we moved and followed buffalo, but we also had homes, grass houses that we built and stayed in and did some agricultural work. And so kind of the best of both worlds, hunting and gathering and agriculturalists. And what they would do is they would create caches of food, underground caches, and put them at our different camping spots so that when we moved, we moved the same places pretty frequently, we had rations and food and dried goods there to sustain our people. And so, just really planning ahead the logistics of movement and providing the basic needs of our people. So again, like we've all shared, each of us have a story. And then if we don't know our story, this is a great opportunity to go seek out that information, because we have these answers and these processes that have worked for many, many years. So getting back to that is helpful in what we do today. Next slide.
And Tasha, I'll just jump in quickly. We did have someone share in the questions box if you want to take a look at that.
Perfect. Let me open that one up here. Esther, I don't see it. Do you mind reading it?
Oh, absolutely. So we are river people and would plan on the timeline of the river. We would have a first salmon ceremony that would start the spring ceremonies. Our year of planning was based on the running of the fish in the river, and that timeline would set the schedule for the year.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I lived in the Pacific Northwest for about a year, and I got to see the salmon run and offer tobacco there, and so that was a really amazing experience. So getting these different examples from all over Indian country is really important. So thank you again for sharing. So really looking at why do we have a strategic plan? It's going to create a roadmap of where we want to go and how we want to get there. I like to call it a snapshot. We in our work at the Tribal Youth Resource Center, we really talk about laying out a map of our journey, where we're going, and also looking back a bit to where we've been, and learning from that when we're making our plans for the future. We also want to establish goals to serve as guides for your project or program, helps us make strategic decisions as well, and guiding the current and future programming of what we're trying to accomplish. And then measuring the effectiveness of the strategies, it really lays a foundation for the logic model, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, and then also evaluation. So that's going to help us moving forward as well. And then really keeping the community, stakeholders, tribal governments engaged, and addressing the specific needs and challenges of our community. It helps us identify those and keep people engaged, including ourselves, because a lot of times when we're the one working on the grant, creating the strategic plan, we are in it and we can't see it. So referring back to it and looking at that snapshot can help us get oriented again about where we're going. And then again, keeping the project or program on track. If we have something to refer to, especially if you create an infographic or something like that, keep it next to your desk, keep it somewhere where you can handily look at it and remind yourself of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So there are many, many reasons to have a strategic plan, and it just really is a helpful tool moving forward as you try to do the work that you're setting out to do. Next slide. So one example, and we'll offer a few of the strategic planning process. As I mentioned, there are so many different models and ways to do this, and we encourage you to find one or make a hybrid of several that works for your community, because every community is different. Your needs and your challenges are specific and different. So we want it to really address what you all have. So this example would be to prepare make offerings according to your tribal or indigenous worldview so that the process is spiritually and culturally grounded. This is, again, goes back to what's in our DNA, our traditional ways of living and being, and really calling on our ancestors to support and help guide the strategic plan and the work that we're going to do. You want to assess it, so engage in a strategic planning needs assessment, and that's going to help you determine how and where to start the strategic planning. Everyone on this call, everyone who's been funded under this grant is going to be in a different place based on the history of their tribe, their interaction with the federal government of their tribe, all of the things. So we really need to figure out where we are as a people and a community before we can make good decisions to move forward. And so then you want to develop that strategic plan with the appropriate stakeholders and engagement and support of tribal leadership and all those people that need to be involved. And then there's the implementation. So really putting that plan into action. A lot of times we make a beautiful plan that has all of the things in it, and then it sits on a shelf. So we really like to encourage you to use this as a tool, a living document, something that can be adjusted if needed, but really is guiding the work in a very pragmatic way. And then you want to communicate really well and effectively, timely, and be inclusive of internal and external partners, because that's how we continue to stay engaged. Engagement isn't a one-stop shop. You don't say everybody's engaged and then leave. We've got to continue to cultivate those relationships and keep people engaged so that we can work together collaboratively to move these projects forward. And then finally, like I mentioned in the other slide, we want to evaluate where we are within within the strategic plan. Are the goals, strategies, and activities in the strategic plan meeting the project's overall goals? So how are these things tying back in to your overarching goal? And if they're not, what do we need to do? How do we need to pivot and readjust to make sure that we are moving at a forward trajectory? So this is one example of a way or framework that you could use for strategic planning, but there are many more. And I think Inafli is going to share another one on the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Chungshi. The next slide, please. So this is another example, and the one that you've seen previously had like 6 steps. So this one has, I think it's 9 or 10 steps. So it kind of really depends on how much you want to get into the details of the process. So this one still has the preparing to plan. Who needs to be involved in strategic planning? What is the organization's level of readiness to engage in strategic planning and establishing that cultural foundation? Doing an environmental scan, engaging the community in strategic planning. A lot of times we, meaning society, will do planning, but we don't really do it with the community. We do it for the community, thinking, well, we have the answers. We know what's going on. And a lot of times, we do have the answers. We do know what's going on. However, it's real important to engage the community, the people that are going to be receiving the services. Were they involved in the planning? Developing the vision statement, mission statement. Next slide, please, because those are pretty straightforward. So determining the goals, objectives, and activities. Are they aligned with the vision and mission? There's something called mission creep, where we kind of creep away from our original mission. And that's easy to do because then we find out as we're going along, well, this needs to get done, that needs to get done. And then pretty soon we find that we're far from our mission. And so we need to get back aligned with, whatever we said we're going to do and whatever our vision is. Smarten the goals. Make sure they're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-oriented. I think realistic can also stand for relevant. Operationalize the goals. Create action plans for each goal. Now, that's really important because we'll say, well, we have this goal to, for example, to provide healing opportunities for all people that have been victimized or have been exposed to violence or have experienced violence. But what is the action plan for that? How are we going to operationalize it? Allocating the resources, making sure there's enough people power, financial resources, other kinds of resources to implement the plan. And that's why the Spartan, the goals is real important, because is it achievable? We might want to do something that we don't really have the resources for, and we need to partner with somebody that has those resources. Monitor, review, evaluate, assess, reassess. So there's a lot of things that, like components that we need to put into that planning process. Next slide, please. So the first steps in strategic planning, these are suggestions and considerations. Engage in cultural strategic planning. We have some resources for you that will help you flesh these things out. So cultural strategic planning might be that you want to design according to your specific culture. Determine the organizational readiness for strategic planning. Sometimes we're not ready, but other times we are ready. But so how do we know that? We have some tools there, for example, on assessing organizational readiness. Convene a working group with specific roles and responsibilities. That's real critical because a lot of times, just because of people's roles, responsibilities, their time factor, there might be just a couple people doing the strategic planning when it should be a shared responsibility. Create a culture that supports strategic planning. For example, providing training in strategic planning. So whenever there's, we're going to develop the strategic plan, but what is it? What is strategic planning? What is involved? And so providing an orientation, an in-service, a training on that. Create a partnership network, establish memorandums of understanding, memorandums of agreement. So those are things that, might be helpful in terms of first steps. Okay, the next slide, please. So cultural strategic planning is really critical because I've been part of planning processes where we jump right into things, and we might have elders in the group that their first language is, the Indigenous language, and we haven't attended to, the certain terms and having translators available. So it really depends on the culture of your people, the culture of your tribe and your community, defining that, what is it that we need to attend to be culturally respectful? Is it aligned? Is the culture of the organization aligned with the culture of the people? Now, that's something that I think is, we sometimes miss that step. Like we say we're going to do something, and then whatever we're doing, how we're doing it is not aligned with the culture of the community or the people. Determining the cultural needs to address the issue or the problem. So one project that I'm working with is really wanting to put cultural and traditional tribal interventions in place to help youth. Now, one of the things that's standing in the way is the effects and the impact of colonization and historical trauma. So some community people will reject, those cultural traditions or interventions. So what they've identified as they need some healing, so an orientation on the impact of historical trauma and how they've become disconnected from their culture. So that's one of the needs, an example of a need, to provide that healing and that forum for people to really discuss, how did we get to this place? For example, I'm going to use an example of child abuse. How did we get to the place where child abuse is very prevalent in our communities when at one time, according to the Lakota worldview, we have the word Wakayaja as a sacred being. So that was the word for child, and the intent and the conceptual meaning is that treat the child as sacred. So how did we, get from here to there? So those kinds of processes to really examine, to really grieve, the disconnection from the culture. So what are the cultural resources to respond to the needs? Identifying, engaging cultural resource people that can help lay the cultural foundation of the organization and the strategic planning process. What are the cultural training needs of the organization, the staff, the partners, the stakeholders? Discuss and determine how the participants in the program are viewed and related to. So sometimes we'll say, these are clients, these are cases, when they are relatives, if we were really congruent with our worldview about we are all related, I think a lot of tribes do ascribe to that universal principle and belief that, we're not only related as humans, but we're related to the earth, to the moon, to the stars, So how are we going to address and view the people that are participating in the program, and by saying clients or cases, we tend to objectify, So thinking about that, that terminology. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Chung-Shi.
Thank you, Ina. So these are some of the suggested elements of a strategic plan, and I think these first, probably these first four, for sure the first two, really go back to that cultural strategic planning that Ina was just talking about. So in your vision and mission, your advisory group, and establishing those community partners, really do want to think about what your worldview is, what kinship terms and kinship relationships exist, not only between individuals, but kinship between organizations, and establishing those deeper connections so that you all can work well together in that piece of the strategic plan. These pieces usually flow a little more naturally for people as they're developing the strategic plan, because they, most of us have done vision and mission before, but really encouraging you all to look at it at a deeper level than you have, especially when we are supporting vulnerable populations of our people who've had, adverse experiences. I think that's super important. And then when we get to 5 and looking at the needs or strengths assessment, and you'll notice that language there, the strengths, because we do want to approach this from a strengths-based perspective as well, not just the deficits that exist within our communities. So that will help us to establish what our needs are and how we're going to address them. You'll notice that the logic model, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is bold, and we will provide specific examples for that, because this is one that takes some time to wrap your mind around, and dedication to really figure out what you want to do. Then also goals, objectives, strategies, and activities with action plans for implementation. So it's more than just listing these things, it's what are we going to do to accomplish them. You do want to have a data collection plan from the onset. That's part of the strategic plan, so that we're not working backwards, gathering tiny sheets of paper or surveys. We really want to know how we're going to collect that and house that. And then you'll see the evaluation plan is also bold, and we'll provide examples of that. Again, when we're collecting the data, how are we going to interpret that and use that moving forward? The communication plan, just really having great communication between all of the partners and relatives that we are working with, so that there's clarity and transparency. And then finally, we list sustainability as one of the final ones that we're suggesting, but we always encourage to have sustainability planning throughout. So that's why it's in the strategic plan, but really thinking at every step, how are we going to sustain this moving forward for our people? So this is just a small list. As we've mentioned, you can customize this to your needs, but these are what we would recommend. Next slide. So looking at the logic models, as I mentioned, this can be a little bit of take a minute to get your mind wrapped around it, but it's going to show the relationship among the components of the program. It's a visual or graphic of the intent, strategies, and hoped for results of the program. When I'm thinking about a logic model, and you'll see the examples, if I think about it traditionally, I could look at a winter count that was on a hide, or sand paintings, cliff dwellings, petroglyphs. That's the imagery that comes to mind, something that we can look at where we are taking into account a variety of different activities and things that have happened or are happening or will happen, and really looking at that to see what kind of results we want to achieve. And the logic model is one of the major elements of an evaluation design, again, adding to that foundation so that when you get to evaluation, you have all of the information organized, and you can draw on that to evaluate your program effectively. And just like the strategic plan as a whole, we do want to encourage you to let this evolve and be living and be flexible, particularly right now as we all continue to move through this global pandemic. I think we've all seen the need for flexibility and being able to adjust and pivot to address needs as they arise in a certain way. And then the model will show a variety of models here shortly. They can be linear or circular, nonlinear, and culturally based. So, I think when we're creating any of these plans or models, it really is an act of sovereignty and us determining what we need, what works best for us. So again, encouraging you to use a hybrid or something that speaks to the needs of your community. Next slide. So strengths of logic models, again, they're graphic, visual, easy to read and digest. And that's why I use the cultural, traditional things that come to my mind. There may be things that come to your mind for your people. It could be a totem or a way that a canoe is carved, something to that effect that really guides the way that you look at and take in information. It does show a logical flow from the problem to strategies and activities to results. So we are seeing it as a flow chart of sorts, very cyclical in how we're looking at information. And it's based on input from the key stakeholders. And again, as part of your strategic plan, you'll determine who those key stakeholders are, and they may shift and change as the needs of your community shift and change. And then it allows for a theoretical framework for the project. Logic models can also be utilized, thinking forward and looking at sustainability, because they're visual, easy to read and show that information and logical flow. They can be used for future funding. It really shows where your program is going, where it's been, and it's a great snapshot to include if you're looking for outside funding as well or continued funding. Next slide.
Thank you, Chungshi. So what we are suggesting is that you would have a visual, a one page of what your project is, so that you can share that with not only your internal staff, but also your partners, the tribal council, the community. So this is an example of a child/youth protection, safety, and wellness logic model. So the issue and the need, and notice that it says issue and need and not problem, because everything, I think Chungshi mentioned before, about the deficit-based language. So if we were to use strength-based language, about what we're facing this issue, we're facing this, we have this need, and that can lead to a response. But problem is kind of like, like problem child, or whenever we use terms like dysfunctional families, we're giving them an identity, that it's not fair because they do have strengths and skills. So in this example, they're identifying the issue and the need that children and youth have died as a result of not being safe and not being protected. And the goal is to enhance the capacity of the community, the agencies to respond. The guiding principles in that little blue box down at the bottom left, Wakaja Wakampi, children are sacred. That's the guiding principle. Okay, if we have that belief, then how do we implement? How do we design, our program? Lakota wo Keshakoi, the 7 sacred principles. And again, I'm using an example from, the Lakota worldview, where we have 7 sacred laws or principles that include compassion, humility, fortitude, respect and honor. There's several of them. Okichaupi, the collaboration is really important because, again, this isn't one program's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility to respond to whatever need there is. Family and extended family voice and input is critical. So inviting the parents, inviting the grandparents and community elders, members of the community to give input. So we can identify sub-problems, objectives, activities, resources. We'll have output measures, we'll have outcome measures, short-term and long-term. Long-term, in this example, is that children are honored and restored to their rightful role as Wakanja, sacred beings, and youth are honored as Wikoshkalaka, young women, and Koshkalaka, young men, and have a rightful role in tribal society. So just reestablishing and restoring the roles and treating them as such is a long-term outcome goal here. Next slide, please. So this is another example of a a template for a logic model, and this is like based on the Indigenous worldview. So at the top there in the lavender shade triangle there, we would have the inputs, the values, and we would go clockwise to the right and have outputs, short terms, and that would include where are we going. But the first one is where have we been, where we have been, like historically in that previous example I shared, children were honored as sacred beings, and that's where we've been. So we would like to get back there, and how are we going to do that? Where we're going to restore the children to their rightful role as sacred beings in that example. So what are the outputs and how will we get there? So that translates to activities and contributors to change. And then when we get there, how will we know when we get there? Those are the long-term outcomes. In that example, we should see child abuse rates go down to zero. That's, we hope our story and our journey, that's how we want to get there. Okay, next slide. And this is an evaluation. So how do we measure? How do we measure what we're doing? This is a evaluation overview from our Tribal Youth Resource Center, and it's an example that you can use. So in the purple circle, you start with preparation and readiness. How do we ready ourselves or make ourselves ready, prepare ourselves for evaluation? And it's kind of like the same as the strategic planning, where you would do training on evaluation. You would create a culture of evaluation, but at the same time having respect for the culture, the tribal sovereignty, all of those issues. Go to the green circle. That's the logic model that we were just talking about. That's where we start with, okay, so this is a picture of our project. What are we going to measure? Pulling performance indicators out of that logic model. So if we were to say, for in that example of restoring children to their rightful role as sacred beings, then we would bring, for example, training to the community, healing to the community, to parents that are involved, for example, in the court system, or parents that are at risk of having their rights terminated because of the child abuse and neglect. So we would have a lot of different activities that we could measure, but it's really up to the program what they identify as evaluation questions. And then in the yellow circle, the outcomes and performance measures would be identified. But of course, there's regard and consideration for evaluation resources. Evaluation can become very costly. It just depends. Maybe partner with the tribal college or with another organization that does have evaluation resources. And then there's the data collection process. What are we going to collect, as far as the data, and how are we going to analyze it so that it translates into our story, telling our story. And of course, the cultural interconnectedness of all of this contributes to, the other components. So that's why they're all kind of interrelated there, shown as interrelated. Okay, the next slide.
So as we mentioned, unfortunately we don't have enough time to dig deep into every aspect of the strategic planning process, but we did want to give you an overview. So just a brief summary of what we've covered, and then your training and technical assistance providers can help you go more in depth if necessary on some of these topics, and we're happy to support as we can. But first, a strategic plan can be a roadmap or guide, blueprint, snapshot of where your project or program or your organization is going and how it will get there. Number two, there are many strategic planning models and processes to choose from. You do have access to this slideshow, and then also a resource sheet where Ina and Ethelene and I have looked at a variety of resources that we think will be helpful, maybe not in their entirety as one standalone, but different pieces of them. So we encourage you to look at those. Cultural relevance and appropriateness is key to establishing the foundation for the strategic plan, because it just really has to lay the foundation of what your community needs. And so we encourage that wholeheartedly. For the strategic planning process does require collaboration with internal and external partners or relatives. So identifying those partnerships and creating those relationships is super important to the overall success and efficacy of your project. And then finally, the strategic planning process is ongoing, and it includes monitoring, review, evaluation when needed, and revision of the strategic plan. So don't be afraid to make those changes and pivots and adjustments as needed, again, specifically in the times that we're living right now. So, you know, be flexible, give yourself grace, give the community flexibility and grace as well. Next slide. I think we're going to open it up for questions right now. So given what we've shared so far, and it feels like we're doing it very quickly from my perspective. So if there are things that we may have gone over too quickly, or you have specific questions, please use the questions box on your control panel to submit questions and or responses to the rest of your cohort here, or you can raise your hand and one of the facilitators will unmute you.
Great, thank you so much. Both of our presenters, that was great. It was a lot of information. I think it will be really helpful. Right, so as Tasha mentioned, again, please feel free to type in your questions. Again, if your control panel minimized itself, look for that small orange arrow. And I'm not seeing any questions at this point, but we'll give it a few minutes in case anything comes to mind. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide with some contact information. Oh, great. And actually, I have a list of resources available for everyone. And I think was also mentioned, you do have some handouts in your resources piece, which has links to a lot of this information. And I'll ask if others, any of our panelists want to add any other comments about the resources.
Sure. Thank you so much, Esther. And we'd really like to hear from you. What are your comments and your feedback? Chung-Shi mentioned we kind of really went fast, but it was in the interest of saving time for your comments, your questions, anything that you'd like to share. I know that your victims assistance programs will have, you know, a lot of resources and a lot of technical assistance through Toja, Lana, and her circle. So that's really great. And if there's anything that we can provide, you know, any right now or after this, you know, then let us know. I think one thing that would really be helpful is looking at other, you know, strategic plans. So you see those, the number one there, there's 3 samples of or examples of strategic plans that deal specifically with victims, survivors, domestic violence. There's also a strategic planning needs assessment questionnaire. So that would lay out, give you some responses about, you know, how do we start our strategic planning. And then there's a pre-checklist. There's a lot of checklists out there, you know, but we thought that this one might be helpful in terms of, you know, really looking at, well, where are we at now, you know, prior to engaging in strategic planning, you know, what is it that we need to be aware of, consider, do, you know, and then there's basic steps in strategic planning. So it really depends on you and your project, you know, how you want to engage, how in depth you want to go. And, you know, one of the things that I've directed programs, you know, on my reservation, I directed a adolescent substance abuse residential center on my reservation for 13 years. I directed children and family mental health programs on my reservation for 9 years. And I really do wish, in hindsight, that I had a lot of the resources that exist today, as far as technical assistance, as far as strategic planning, because that would have been so helpful, and it would have saved a lot of steps and, helped to address a lot of challenges. So take advantage of these resources, the technical assistance. There's a strategic planning guide as a resource. And then we have a Tribal Youth Resource Center evaluation resource binder, kind of a long term, but there's a lot of information in there. There's tools, there's templates. I think there's a cultural identity survey in there that would help to assess, how people are responding to, cultural information that's provided, and if they would like to learn more about their culture or their language. There's the logic model templates in there that you can download or that you can open up and you can use and adapt to your own project. So there's a lot of resources there. And like I said, that it's what you're dealing with as a program, is really tough. It's really challenging, to deal with victims, assistance, victim survivors, domestic violence, keeping the community safe. So reach out, and I just like to encourage all of you that you're not alone, even though we're here virtually, we're still available and accessible. So with that, any questions or comments?
Thank you so much. We do have a couple in our questions box. So I have one question, which is for grant compliance, what strategic information needs to be submitted? And I'll go ahead and answer that one. So you'll, in your letter of agreement, I know that not everyone might have received theirs yet if you're still working on your budget. Again, thank you so much for your patience and working with First Pick. But once you get your letter of agreement, it provides a schedule of the when your program reports are due. And that's, we covered the content of those program reports a bit on our previous webinars. And that's some of the, data that you'll need to collect and report. And kind of the long way of answering your question is that it's those quarterly program reports where you'll be providing updates on the status of your project. So some of it is that, specific data pieces for some of the actual services that you're providing. And then some of it is some narrative questions, and that's where you'll that's your opportunity to provide more information about your strategic planning process. But beyond that, you don't otherwise have to submit any particular information to us about your strategic plans and process so far. But you are welcome if you, again, the Tribal Law and Policy Institute is available to help if you have any questions or you want to talk through, the plan that you've developed or, the engagement with your other community members. We're really happy to help there. So I hope that answers your question, and please feel free to follow up if it did not. But again, it's the program reports that you'll submit on a quarterly basis, and those deadlines are in the letter of agreement, and that's where you'll be providing information about your progress on your grant project. And then next, we had a really nice comment. It was a thank you to our panelists for providing really good information. And I'll read just a bit of it, and I'll otherwise kind of share that with our panelists so that they have it. Was that, I enjoyed that you were able to break it down and let everyone know that if you look at yourself within your tribal community, then you can see examples of strategic planning within our people that you might not have otherwise seen as a strategic plan. So kind of framing it in this light. So thank you so much for those nice words. Again, I'll pass along the full comment to all of our panelists. And with that, I don't see any other questions. Again, please feel free to reach out moving forward. Let's go ahead and put up our contact information slide. And then I otherwise just want to, again, say thank you to our panelists for putting this together, providing really good information.
Thank you, Esther. Oh, just one quick note, and we do have a formal closing, and I did want to say thank you to everyone for participating. Just to go back briefly to what you said and what the comment was in regard to looking at our traditional strategic planning. One thing that I do like to note when I'm talking about strategic planning, because I do it with this work with TLPI, I do it with the National Criminal Justice Training Center, and then I also do it as a consultant, a private consultant working on strategic plans, is that when we're looking at this cultural perspective, you know, a lot of times our tribes have things that have been lost to us that is no fault of our own, that we have lost these ways. So I would encourage you to look regionally at sister tribes, if those are things that are missing pieces to your puzzle, because it does add value, and to try to seek out that knowledge and information in other ways. So that was just a final note. But for me, in my Wichita language, I do want to say tsutits. Thank you all for joining, and we'll turn it over to Lana for our closing, I believe.
Oh, thank you to Tui Ethling again, and to Tasha. I think, you know, as we look at this Western kind of way of strategic planning, I think just for me personally and tribes that I've worked with, it becomes overwhelming. So I appreciate the comment that our grantee posed in appreciation, because it makes it accessible, and it makes it a way that seems that we can do that within our tribes, because that's within our DNA codes, our innate responses to how we care for one another as relatives. That's that Matakioasin. And I think for, you know, each of our tribal communities, it really has that feeling of inclusion and understanding that we have all the answers within our communities. So, you know, that's that fullness and that breath that we're able to breathe into our strategic planning process really should come from, you know, our communities, our land, our ways of knowing, and really pulling that together. So that's what I appreciate about today, and about what we have set forth for you folks, the intentions for planning. And we're going to close today. I'm just going to close with a song, because I think, you know, as we opened with a beautiful Wachekia prayer from Tui Ethling, I want to close with a song, because part of, you know, our ways of understanding and knowing is really looking to our culture to understand how we move forward in that way. And so from my father's people, you know, we talked about how we move through the waterways, through the ocean. Somebody mentioned salmon, and, you know, for us, we followed those cycles of life as well. But we also understood that there were times that we would have to travel to one another, and maybe, you know, in the future, as this pandemic, you know, comes to that, hopefully, where we're able to gather again, you know, we can look forward to that time. But until then, you know, we set forth our canoes, we set forth our planning, we set forth our time of telling, our time of gathering medicines. And so traditionally within our Tlingit culture, we traveled on the waterways, and whenever we had those intentions to set forth out on the water, the opposite clans or where we were traveling to would light fires on the beach, and they would light the fires that were kept inside of the trees so that they could be protected from the elements. But it provided a way, a light for those that would be traveling to their community to plan together as nations, as clans. And so I'll just sing a song that talks about traveling on those waterways, and then we have just a couple more announcements after that. Way, way, we are hey. Way, way, we are hey. Oh, away we hey, hey. So that's for your journey. And next slide. So we also wanted to let folks know that in addition to the many, many resources that were shared today, that we have, just that understanding that, there's always knowledge and information available. And as technical assistance providers, we want to be able to connect with you over the next 19 months or so for the remainder of this grant period. And we will be in contact with each one of you by telephone to set up a time to go over a strategic, or not strategic, but technical assistance plan, which will include strategic planning. So if there are additional, resources in the meantime, until we connect with you, you can visit our website at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, as well as our own website, tribalvictimresources.org. Next slide. This is our contact information. So if you have not or have questions regarding any of the financial, those are listed on your screen. Again, the technical assistance questions regarding and pertaining to strategic planning, tribal codes, as well as the community needs assessments, or developing new programming within your community regarding victim services. My contact information is there, as well as my colleague Heather Torres, or just general questions, microgrants@ncai.org. So I just want to see if any of our panelists have any final words before we close today.
I would just like to say thank you for the honor of sharing with you all in this circle, and I really appreciate the organizers, and appreciate all of you doing the work up there, and thank you for having us. Pilamaya, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and good luck with all of the work that you're going to do. I'll be thinking about you, and your programs and your communities will be in my prayers. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you to Etheline again from the bottom of my heart, and Tasha for sharing all of your knowledge today with our grantees as they set forth on this planning process. And I also want to thank our NCAI microgrant fund organizers as well, Esther and other folks at NCAI, for having this vision for our people. And to my colleagues who work with me at Tribal Law and Policy Institute, Heather and Abby, who work on this specifically, thank you for your time and your attention. And with that, we will close today's webinar, and we thank each and every one of you for joining us here today. And again, we will be in contact with you soon. Nina Wopida, Ganesh Tish.